In My Blood It Runs, directed by Maya Newell, is an observational documentary from the perspective of a 10-year-old Aboriginal Australian boy named Duan. He and his family are living in Alice Springs, and he is struggling to balance his traditional Arenda Goa upbringing with a state education. This film explores rather deep and powerful themes relating to Indigenous children and the relationship between them and our education system. To further analyse this film, I'll be looking at it through two distinct lenses I've encountered in class, which are Week 5's topic of student diversity, family context, class, culture and schooling, and Week 9's topic of race, indigenuity, multiculturalism and equity in education. Throughout the entirety of the documentary, it is highly evident that something about traditional schooling and education is simply not working for Duan, and the film shows the stark contrast between his behaviours and performance at school and on his ancestral homeland, where he is surrounded by family and where he is clearly far more focused and engaged in learning. In the topic's textbook, Education, Change and Society, Chapter 4 discusses at length the idea that remote communities and rural schooling require state and federal government support to thrive, and the chapter concludes by saying, and I quote, "Developing effective, good quality education for rural and remote communities, including Indigenous communities, cannot be sustained by the communities alone. Outside support is crucial, including from state and federal governments and related agencies." Welch, 2018. While this may be true in some sense, the documentary seems to be completely against this notion. Firstly, we can see that through Duan's poor performance and grades in school, that this support hasn't at all been effective for Duan's education, and likely others as well. It is also evident by Duan's clear disdain for traditional state education, as he can be seen misbehaving in class and is also prone to run away from school. And he also very clearly does not want to go to school most days, as he wakes up in the morning showing the audience that this effective and good quality education is simply not translating well and working for Duan. Even though Duan is failing in school and facing increasing scrutiny from welfare and the police, he's an extremely gifted and bright young boy, as can be seen when he is in his own element, surrounded by family and members of his own culture. Duan is a child healer, a good hunter, and speaks 3 languages. On top of this, he shares his wisdom and vast knowledge of history and the complex world around him throughout the entire documentary, and we can see his spark and intelligence, which unfortunately is not being adequately nurtured by traditional state schooling, whereas he is very clearly being taught and nurtured effectively by his family and community rather than his school. While it's unfortunate that Duan is not benefiting from traditional education, it is clear regardless that Indigenous communities are clearly capable of providing things that schools and governments simply are not at this time, as learning is clearly easier for students like Duan when they are taught in their own preferred language and within the context of their culture and country. After my first viewing of this documentary, I found it to be highly evident throughout that Aboriginal culture, history and beliefs, while being extremely important to Duan and his family, is glossed over and neglected by the teachers at Saturday Primary School, and the ideas of multiculturalism are being ignored, with there being no equity in what is being taught, as the school favours white traditional education. In the article Lazy Multiculturalism, Cultural Essentialism and the Persistence of the Multicultural Day in Australian Schools by Meg Noble and Greg Watkins, the idea that within schools there is a present and tokenistic treatment of race within the curriculums is one of the article's main talking points. And while the article applies this more to multicultural school events like Multicultural Day, I have interpreted it as also applying to what is being taught within schools, as I believe that from what I have observed in this documentary, Indigenous education is little more than trivial in the eyes of schools. I believe this can be seen in 2 very similar scenes during class at Saturday Primary School, and one at a later point while Duan is being taught at Yipirinya School. The first of these scenes is one where Duan is in class learning about Captain Cook and the First Fleet, and how they sailed and adventured through Australia before claiming it as their own by planting a British flag. This story is clearly being watered down and told in a positive light from the perspective of settlers, neglecting the less savoury aspects of Cook's trip. Dwan even mentions after this class that this version of events being told was for white people and not for Aboriginals. And he also discusses how the history he's taught at home is about the perspective of the Indigenous people. The second scene is a white teacher telling an Indigenous Dreamtime story about how the spirit of life was dreaming of fire. However, she goes on to say that she doesn't have any idea how the spirit works, implying that she has little interest or knowledge on the concept. Right after this is when an Indigenous student speaks up and says the spirit is real, to which the teacher proceeds to ignore them and their comment before moving on to the next part of the story that they likely don't understand. Later on in the film, while Dwan is attending Iparinya School, a school intended specifically for Aboriginal education, only 30 minutes of the school day is being allocated to the Aboriginal language due to successive government policy, showing that teaching Aboriginal students of their own culture and language is simply not high on the list of importance within schools, even those intended specifically to teach it. From this alone, it's clear that within the schools Dwan attends, ideas of race, indigenuity, multiculturalism and equity in education are an afterthought, and the bare minimum is being taught, almost as if they are simply ticking the box of Indigenous education. Aboriginal students are being deprived of an actual history lesson, and they must learn the dark truth from other sources like their parents. Not only that, but there is no clear energy and engagement from teachers, as they clearly care very little for the topics they are supposed to be teaching their students. And to make it all the worse, Indigenous education is barely even being taught at a school specifically catered for the Indigenous population.